Good afternoon, and on behalf of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, welcome to our Inclusive Response and Recovery webinar series. Today's topic is building an inclusive response and recovery for America's workforce. Before we get started, I want to remind all participants that today's webinar is being recorded, but we do welcome you to also tweet and post about this using the hashtag #InclusiveRecoveryUS. Again, that's hashtag #InclusiveRecoveryUS. All attendees are currently muted. You may submit questions using the Q&A function of your Zoom app. We will be taking questions after the panelists present. And now please welcome the founder and president of the Center for Inclusive Growth, Shamina Singh.
Thanks, Parag. Hi, everybody. I'm Shamina Singh, and as Parag said, I'm the founder and president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is sort of the philanthropic hub of MasterCard. Thank you for joining today's webinar. It's the latest in our series of inclusive response and recovery, Zoominars, as we like to call them. To date, we've hosted about 9, bringing together over 1,500 people from around the world to discuss the strategies around response, recovery, and resilience as COVID-19 reshapes lives and livelihoods. Today's topic, building an inclusive, responsive, and recovery for America's workforce, is one that's actually near and dear to my heart. Earlier in my professional life, I worked for SEIU as the labor research and organizer. And it was there that I really got to practice this commitment to helping people survive, thrive, and if we got it right, strive for more. And that's what sort of led me to MasterCard and the creation of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. At the center, we deploy MasterCard's assets and competencies, its data, technology, products, brand, reach, and people to help ensure that as economies grow, the benefits of that growth are broadly shared. Indeed, at the center, we're focused on making sure that the digital economy works for everyone, everywhere. And one of the ways in which we translate that into action is through a focus on the future of workers. Specifically, our focus is enabling financial security and economic mobility by supporting access to and the financing of lifelong learning. And we believe this is best realized through a system of portable benefits. In thinking about the future of workers, what this pandemic has made clear is that we can't shy away from the urgent need to build a more secure present of workers. Indeed, the so-called future of work is here now. Today's conversation will undoubtedly help us better understand how people's lives have been impacted by COVID-19, what's at stake, and how we can work together to imagine and realize a better world for workers today and into the future. There's so much uncertainty right now about how to support the U.S., our country's most vulnerable workers in this moment, with a record number of people registering for unemployment and industries completely shut down, and what the knock-on effects for the workforce might be as a result of this crisis. Leaders across the public, private, philanthropic, and workforce development sectors are all trying to parse out what actions they can take to provide relief to the workforce now and prepare workers for a more secure, inclusive future in the long run. And we're delighted to have this amazingly fantastic, best of the best panel of friends of the center to help us get to some of those answers. Thanks again for joining, and with that, I'll hand it back over to Parag.
Thank you, Shamina. We have an incredible turnout today for this webinar. Over 200 people are participating from around the world. And my name is Parag Mehta. I serve as the Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Growth at MasterCard. Part of my responsibility at the center is leading our work on the future of workers. And over the past year, as Shamina said, we have been investigating the question about how do you help workers navigate the digital economy. When we started this work, we thought about the issue of lifelong learning and how do we help workers acquire the skills they need to be able to respond effectively and successfully to the growing threats of things like automation in the workforce. And we began to investigate the opportunities to create a new system of portable benefits that would help workers access not only education and skilling, but a whole slew of core benefits that are necessary to succeed in this economy. It occurs to me that this is not new. We have gone through big transitions in the workforce before. The move from agriculture to industrial, the move from manufacturing to digital. The typing pool was killed by the personal computer. But the difference this time is we thought we had time to plan for it. We thought we had time to be deliberate. And when I used to talk about this, I would always reference a scene from one of my favorite movies. In the film Hidden Figures, it tells the story of a group of human computers at NASA, a group of African American women who helped launch the first man into space through their computation. And one of the B storylines is about the real life character of Dorothy Vaughan, who was a supervisor of mathematicians at NASA and saw the growing threat coming from new technologies. There's a moment in the film where she sees a big IBM computer being brought into the headquarters. It's the size of an entire conference room. And she quickly recognizes the threat that this computer is going to pose to the women that she supervises because it's going to replace them. And she makes the decision to go to the public library, check out a book, and learn everything she can about this technology and train her human computers to become operators of this machinery so that by the time it's up and running, when the big boys upstairs don't know how to run it, it's her women who take over the operation of the model. And I've been thinking about what is that moment in a person's brain that directs them to do what Dorothy Vaughan did? To me, it comes from a little bit of intuition, a little bit of preparation, but it also comes from the kind of expertise that we have on our panel today. To me, the people that we're going to hear from are that voice in our heads telling us to look to the future and helping us figure out how best to prepare for it. So I'm really excited to share with you the three panelists who will be leading our conversation today. The first is Marcela Escobari. She's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She leads the Workforce of the Future initiative for Brookings. She had a prolific career in public service prior to joining Brookings, but I'm most proud to say that Marcela is a fellow Center for Inclusive Growth alumnus. She started at MasterCard a month after me, helping us to set up our research and our work on this and other topics. And so we're really glad to have Marcela join us today. Second, we'll be joined by David Otter. He is the Ford Professor of Economics at MIT, and he is the co-chair of JPAL's work of the Future Initiative. If I were Marty McFly in another movie, Back to the Future, and I had to go back in time and identify the perfect human being to be on a panel about this topic, I would have gone back and created David Otter, because David is an expert on all things related to China and on automation and on the American worker, and what three topics could be more perfect for the conversation we need to have right now. And finally, my dear friend Byron Auguste is the co-founder and CEO of Opportunity at Work, which is an organization that is dedicated to rewiring the US labor market so that all individuals have an opportunity to participate and to succeed. He is the genius behind Skilled Through Alternative Routes, which you'll hear about today, or the STARS, which is a group of about 70 million Americans in low-wage jobs, but not necessarily low-skilled. And I'm excited that he'll be talking to us about that. I should also point out that Byron has another gig today. After he leaves us on this webinar, he's going to go join another one moderated by a former boss of ours, Barack Obama. So we're glad that we could get squeezed in before he and President Obama have to chat today. So let's start with Marcela. And Marcela, I want to begin with you and ask you to react to a quote that you shared before COVID. You famously said that economic growth has exacerbated inequalities with the most vulnerable workers at risk of being left behind. As the labor market splits into low-wage and high-wage work, lower-tier jobs are precarious, marked by unpredictable schedules, reduced benefits, and stagnant wages. In the face of these trends, reskilling alone will not be enough to lessen inequality or provide equal opportunity. However, reskilling will be integral to the social scaffolding that can support economically vulnerable workers. My question to you, does this quote still stand in the immediate wake of COVID-19? And how do you think data can help cities change the trajectory of inequality and opportunity? Marcela.
Well, thank you, Parag and Shamina for the opportunity to join this impressive group. I think as you refer to this quote, I think in some ways the question of what we've been trying to solve for has not fundamentally changed. Just the pervasiveness of low-wage work and the precariousness of that work. Right before this crisis, we had 53 million Americans that made less than $16 an hour on average. That was 44% of the American workforce. These numbers are bound to expand. Those in the lowest quintile tended to cycle from job to job the most without seeing any wage growth. So if anything, the pandemic has just laid bare the inadequate, flimsy safety net that was available for these workers. and an employment system that has prized flexibility and cost over security and mobility. And thus we have the dramatic unemployment numbers that you talked about that have reached 26 million this week, and many slipping into poverty. And the size and the jump of the unemployment numbers is higher in the US than in many other OECD countries. But we knew before this crisis, when we were at 3% unemployment, that these aggregate numbers did not represent the reality for most Americans, and that any shock was likely to hit the most vulnerable workers with increased severity. Now, we were not expecting the size and the nature of this shock, right? Which has been a double whammy for vulnerable workers that are clustered in hospitality and other face-to-face service industries. But the forces at play, those that have led to the precariousness and the low quality of low-wage work, have been at play for the last 40 years. They were here before the crisis, and they will continue to be here after this crisis. Right? Wage stagnation at the lower end, lower economic mobility, workers dropping out of the workforce. We're at the lowest labor participation rates for men in US history. And what David Otter has brought to our collective consciousness, this barbelization of the labor force, right? The bifurcation of jobs between low wage and high wage, and the erosion of the middle class. And the forces of these trends, automation, digitization, the rise of contract work, will continue to be at play, if not to accelerate. While our investments, right, in helping people upgrade their skills or transition to better jobs, let alone any incentives to create better jobs, have actually dwindled in the same period of time. We spent today 1/4 of what we spent in the 1970s in training and workforce support. And that's a fraction of what the OECD spends in training also. So the question, I think, right now is, as we're putting massive funds to help people weather the storm and get back to work, can we also take this opportunity to build a more robust system, that includes firm level practices, that includes regulation, and that tackles these forces, which we know have left the whole economic system fragile. And because if we tackle those original forces, I think that will help us now, but that will help us in the next crisis. So to your second question of what have we been working on, is in terms of bringing data to this question, is it still relevant in a post-COVID world? I mean, the way we looked at it is thinking about 3 buckets of solutions that we were trying to inform with data at a very granular city level. And I think that these are still relevant, and in some cases, more so because they've taken such a hard hit. So one is, how do you grow and how do you create better jobs? And I think in a post-COVID world, how do you recover from contraction and build back better, right? The second bucket is, how do we help workers transition to higher paying jobs? And it's true that today, for many more, the question will be, how do I get back into the workforce? And the third one is, what will be the policies that make these upward transitions possible, right? Affordable housing, transport, childcare. And I think these will continue to be relevant even beyond the immediate need for cash. So what we've tried to inform is, in charting a path toward growth, we've tried to provide each city with a map of the industries that are feasible for them, which means they can build on their existing strengths. They're strategic in that they use capabilities and talents that are shared with other complex industries so that they can accelerate their growth, and which provide good jobs, for the people they have. And we focus on cities because we think each of them require a unique path. And we still think that this will be relevant during a contraction because, some industries and firms will not come back. And in a post-COVID world, cities will need to be even more deliberate in how they spend, scarce resources to build back better. And in many cases, it's going to mean that they're going to lose capabilities that they once had. Now, we have added another lens, for this moment, which is trying to help each city understand, where are their most vulnerable workers? Those workers that make low wages and also don't have employer-based healthcare. And that's because we think these are the workers that have the most tenuous link to their employer and are the likeliest to see layoffs or reduced hours. So we want to give each city a sense of how exposed their workers will be to this crisis. But we show that exposure is not just a function of industry mix, but also the worker arrangements within the firms that industry hosts. And here, we have the example of Las Vegas. Las Vegas economy is concentrated in hospitality, which, as you saw before, as a nation, 50% of hospitality workers are vulnerable workers. So hospitality in Las Vegas makes 30% of its workforce. But actually, compared to other cities, they have a third less vulnerable workers because of stronger worker arrangements that have made those jobs less precarious. And thus, they have seen more workers being able to keep their benefits and attachment to their employers, even through this crisis. So we hope that this analysis can still help cities as they consider their unique strengths, in terms of how they're going to rebuild their industries, but also a new angle on how exposed and vulnerable their own workers are as they think of rebuilding. The second piece of analysis that I wanted to share and last is this idea of transitions. We had built a job-to-job transition matrix with over 100,000 real job transitions from the CPS. And this was originally to help workers, which we think is still relevant, understand what options are available to them from every occupation, from a certain occupation. So what's possible because others have taken a similar path, and what's possible that also offers a significant jump in salary. And we have a rank of mobility for every occupation. And the idea was that this would help workers navigate their careers, but also help firms to be more expansive in the candidates that they consider for higher wage jobs. When we think about how to use this data for the now, we've adapted it to see if we can help companies who are seeing big demand and surges in workers, albeit they're not many, kind of the Amazon, the Walmarts, hospitals, to know where could they source workers from what occupations that tend to move to the occupation that you're looking for, but also from other sectors that are contracting right now. So to give you an example, is there an opportunity for furloughed flight attendants who are used to dealing with crowds and emergency protocols to help triage in overwhelmed hospitals? Or a more specific one in the news now, right? Walmart just announced 50,000 temporary positions for stock and order fillers in stores and distribution centers. We can show who tends to become a stock filler: cashiers, retail workers from department stores, even cooks. And that may be able to help companies hire or even work together with other companies like Macy's to redeploy, 125,000 furloughed workers that Macy has, rather quickly and with limited training. So, this is the type of we think creative and bold ideas that we hope people take us up on, because if we are able, any initiative that can help workers maintain their connection to their employers is going to help in their recovery. But anyway, to conclude and pass it back to Parag, we believe in providing data to inform decisions and at a very granular level. But in the end, building a more resilient workforce is going to depend on a systemic change, right? That will include massively expanding the reskilling infrastructure that does not reinforce existing inequities, changes at the firm level practices that improve job quality, and inevitably a more robust, set of regulations and policies, from working rules, wage subsidies, protections of contract workers, and worker voice. And with that, Parag, I pass it on back to you.
Thank you, Marcela. I have lots of questions, and I'm sure our participants do too. So please use the Q&A function, and after we finish with all the panelists, we'll come back to your questions. But thank you, Marcela, for getting us started on such a strong note. I want to now move to Professor David Otter at MIT. David, you said a while back the following: "I'm not yet convinced that we will face an unemployment problem created by artificial intelligence. There will certainly be some occupations eliminated, drivers of vehicles, any production jobs, etc. Whether this creates mass unemployment depends on how quickly this happens. If it happens overnight, it will be a huge disruption. If it occurs over 20 years, as seems more likely, then it will be challenging but manageable. Maybe it was an AI we should have been concerned about. It should have been a virus. What do you think about that now? And do you still believe that we have a long ramp to prepare for this?
Well, good. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Parag. And thank you, Shamina, for inviting me. And I enjoyed Marcella's presentation very much. I think that there's an irony here, which is we're spending a lot of our time worrying about automation. And of course, the crisis that we're facing now has very little to do with automation. And in some ways, automation is our friend in terms of managing it. However, it will, as I will say in a minute, accelerate the process of automation. So I don't, on the one hand, you would say, oh, we were worried about the wrong thing. On the other, I think even as we come out of this crisis, we will be, the challenges will in fact accelerate. So I think there's, as Marcella emphasized, we were aware of many of these underlying weaknesses and insecurities in the US labor market. This current crisis makes them all the more painfully apparent, but hopefully also creates opportunities because of our heightened awareness and heightened public awareness to change the trajectory going forward. Great, so I wanted to just speak for a few minutes about the preparing for the post-COVID labor market. So let me first say what it was the pre-COVID labor market, where were we headed? And really there were three trends that I think were particularly relevant. One was intensive growth of care work and in-person services, as Marcella emphasized. A second was an abundance of jobs, but poor career prospects for non-college workers. And a third is an aging population, which created a demographic crunch and a high pressure labor market. So let me just talk in brief about each of those phenomena. So starting with the shape of employment growth, this is what Marcella referred to as the barbellization. I could have next slide, please. And showing you that if you lay occupations out from kind of low paid to high paid, you see this growth on either end of the chart. On the left-hand side in yellow, you see growth of personal health aides and other personal services, food service, cleaning, home health aides, entertainment, recreation, security, transportation, repair. Those are typically low-paid jobs with limited credentials and many openings. They are numerically abundant, but they do not. They tend to be among the lowest paid and least secure jobs in the economy. They're growing rapidly. In the middle, you see production, operative, clerical, administrative support, increasingly sales. Those tend to be better educated, better paid, more secure. They are contracting in the face of automation, some degree trade as well when we're talking about production occupations. And then third, on the right, you see professional, technical, and managerial jobs. These are high paid, secure, creative jobs by and large, held mostly by people with four-year college degrees and above. If I can show you the next slide, what you'll see is the growth of that lower of those personal service jobs is really dominated by what's happening among non-college workers. That whole left-hand side of the figure is this kind of polarization, the movement of non-college workers out of the middle and towards the less secure, lower paid work. And I should also mention, in context of what Marcella said a moment ago, that is particularly happening in urban areas, that this polarization is really driven by a lot of what's happening in metro areas and cities where non-college workers have moved out of offices, out of factories, and into personal services, food service, driving vehicles, cleaning buildings. It used to be there was a lot more mixing between highly educated and less educated workers in the same offices, jointly producing things, and now increasingly their interactions are service interactions. Moving forward to the next slide, I want to emphasize that going forward, if you look at the projections of where employment, at least what BLS was projecting in 2018, obviously not thinking about the COVID crisis, most of the work that is projected to add jobs over the next decade are in relatively low educated jobs below the median wage. So these 20 top jobs account for what are projected to be 55% of all net employment growth. In this time, they are in personal care, food service, home health aides, some construction, some transportation. And so most of this work will continue, or is at least expected to continue, this barbell. That was the projection. And moving to the next slide, one of the key factors that contributes to this kind of pattern is the changing age structure of the US population. I think this is underemphasized in many discussions. The red and green lines show you the age distribution of the US population in 2000 and 2040. You can see over that 40-year period, we're in the middle of it, the fraction of people who are children, youth, and students under 25 will shrink considerably. The fraction that are in the prime age working years of 25 to 65 will also shrink. And of course, the fraction that are seniors will grow substantially. That's a reflection of, one, the aging of the baby boom. Two, we have fertility rates now that are below replacement, so smaller cohorts entering the labor force. Three, our draconian immigration policies are also stemming the supply of young adults into the labor force. And four, rising educational attainment, which was rising robustly in the last decade, also reduces the supply of people who are going to want to do many of those service occupations. So the good and the kind of mixed picture that comes out of this is we have a lot of growth of not highly credentialed, not highly educated occupations. However, the slowing supply of labor to that set of work was actually creating upward wage pressure and creating this high pressure labor market. And if trends had continued, labor force participation would have continued to rise and wages would have continued to rise. Not that those jobs would have been secure, but they would have been better than they had been 5 years earlier. Okay, so now, if we can just skip 2 slides, I won't linger on the one that's right immediately ahead of us. One more, please. So why does COVID change the trajectory? So there are 4 ways that the post-COVID labor market is going to look different from the pre-COVID labor market. One is that, at least for the foreseeable future, consumers are going to be shunning many in-person services until we have a reliable vaccine or course of treatment. 2, employers are learning how to do without workers. Just like many of us are learning how to use Zoom, learning how to teach online, learning how to do a lot of things that we didn't know how to do previously, employers are realizing or discovering there are more activities that they can do with less labor when they have to. That's going to include, and going forward, they're not going to unlearn that lesson. So we will see more electronic checkout, more electronic service, a lot replacement of people with machine interfaces, more robots cleaning stores, more robots taking stock, more robots showing you around. You're going to be in a less worker-dense type of service economy than we were previously. So that lesson will not be quickly unlearned. That's the nature of incentives. A third factor, and of course, Shameen already recognized this, retail employment is a big provider of low wage but accessible jobs. We already see from what's happening with JCPenney, what's happening with Macy's and so on, it's very unlikely that retail employment will come back to where it was. And so that's an immediate hit to a numerous, not highly paid, but numerous employment opportunity. And finally, the fourth factor is, and this is one that many economists are aware of, and it's not talked about as much in the popular press, but labor's share of national income, in other words, the share of what firms produce that is paid to workers as opposed to paid to capital owners or to profits, has fallen considerably, about 5 to 8 percentage points since the year 2000, after being steady for about 50 or 60 years. And a lot of that fall in labor share reflects the reallocation of employment from smaller firms to large, sophisticated firms that are more capital intensive and less labor intensive. So when stores go from little retail stores to Walmart, or they go online, or all the health insurers consolidate, that actually has the effect of reducing the share of national income paid to labor. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis is really going to cull the ranks of small and medium firms. We're going to be in much more of a economic monoculture of large firms, and that is, again, going to further depress labor share of national income. So in these 4 ways, the post-COVID economy, or post-COVID labor market, is going to look different from the one that we went into it with. So now let me conclude by talking about 4 things that we can do to prepare. So the first, of course, is, or maybe not of course, but is to rebuild inclusive labor market institutions. Of course, I don't need to say to anyone, labor, the representation of workers in organized forms has fallen enormously. But one thing that this crisis has done is made us aware that many of the workers who we see as most dispensable in many day-to-day situations turn out to be most indispensable. Those are the people doing low-paid care work. Those are people delivering, working at grocery stores and cleaning and doing delivery services. And to the credit of our political leadership, in fact, we recognize that. We extended unemployment insurance. We created to people who were never previously covered. We did the CARES Act dispensed income to a lot of households. And so we recognized at least that those people need to be part of the umbrella. And moreover, we also see that many of those individuals are taking grave risks to their personal health in the course of their day-to-day work and yet have no voice to express it. They cannot bargain for their own safety if they're not represented by a union. I don't think that's the way the world should work, but that is the way the US labor market works at present. So this is an opportunity now that we have recognized that to do something about it. A second factor, and this really goes to very actionable policy, is our tax policy is really skewed towards subsidizing firms to invest in capital rather than invest in workers. At the margin, when you buy a machine that replaces a worker, the government goes in on that with you by giving you a tax credit. And even in the CARES Act, we actually subsidize the write-down of capital, the faster depreciation. Why are we subsidizing replacing workers rather than augmenting them at the time when we are now entering an economy with an unemployment rate greater than 20%? That is addressable. Our tax code is adjustable and it's highly skewed. A third, of course, I keep saying of course, maybe it's not of course, this is an opportunity to accelerate learning and credentialing. I'm sure I know this is something Byron will speak about. There's lots of needs in care work, but also in tech positions, that many of which do not require a computer science degree, in skilled manufacturing. A college is not necessarily required for these jobs, but we have slow mechanisms for delivering that training. Often, most healthcare training has to be done in person. We can do better. We can now we can accelerate our own learning and our deployment systems, and of course the supports to roll that out and scale it up. Finally, as mentioned, I actually am one of the co-directors of the MIT Work of the Future Task Force, which is kind of looking at this in the big picture, and also of the Poverty Action Lab, the Geneva Poverty Action Lab's experimental initiative. And really now is the time for experimentation. We are making massive social investments. We are spending 10% of GDP in the course of a few weeks to do social policy. We should be using that as an opportunity for learning what we can do more effectively. So we've extended unemployment insurance in whole new ways. We can look at unemployment insurance reemployment bonuses, right? You're getting $600 extra a week to not work. What if you got to keep that and went back to work? Similarly, we could do, we should be using this opportunity to reinvest in ourselves. We can learn about what's effective when we do that type of infrastructure investing. Similarly, we need, and are already inadvertently entering a kind of a space race for online learning. That's another opportunity for experimentation with what works. So as we prepare, we know the labor market is going to look different. We also know that we are making big social policy investments, some of which we would not have predicted we would have made. I hope we can use those to learn and improve the steps we're taking and the priorities that are built into our institutions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Those are really good and concrete recommendations, and actually a perfect segue to our final panelists as we think about item 3 on David's list. This is something that Byron Agist has been thinking about and consumed with for quite some time. So Byron, I want to turn to you now as the practitioner voice in this conversation. And I want to share a quote from what you said in an op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times about a year ago. You wrote, "Creating a lifelong learning to earning system is profoundly in the self-interest of college grads, because the same backward-looking practices that hurt those without college degrees today, namely ignoring their non-traditional training, screening them out of jobs, and devaluing their potential, those same factors may very well hurt those of us with degrees tomorrow. If we can accept a system where some hardworking people can be denied any pathway to opportunity, we never know when our own bridge will collapse. This idea that we are all tied together in this shared fabric of destiny. I'm curious if you still believe that that's true, if you believe it's more true now than it was even when you wrote it.
Yeah, no, I think that that is true. And the point that I was making there, and it'll become more, I think, clear in the presentation, is that there was a lot of discussion. There's maybe going to be a little less now about a skills gap, right? Like, I mean, so this and the over simple version of it is just that, oh, there's not enough skilled workers. I mean, that is, for a lot of reasons, that's not really a valid way to think about it. A more sophisticated version where there were these mismatches, and that you couldn't quite get the sort of the right skills for the jobs you needed, and that education wasn't producing it. But the observation was that the way the demand side of the job market works, the way employers do hiring, and this has not always been like this, but it is very much like this today and has become the last few years, is that they screen out most applicants before assessing their skills. They screen them out based on pedigree. That might be the jobs they've worked at, but one major thing is the bachelor's degree requirement has gone sky high over sort of many years. You know, a third of administrative assistants have bachelor's degrees, but 3/4 of the new job postings for administrative assistants require bachelor's degrees. And so you're screening out large numbers of people. And the point is, it is a backward looking thing. So in other words, if you can get a job based on your skills, we know there are ways to acquire new skills. That's called learning. But if you can only acquire a job based on your pedigree, that is to say, based on your history, well, you can't get new history. That's called lying. And so the more dynamic the economy is, the more new skills pop up, the more people won't have the right history, right? Part of the reason I too love that movie, Hidden Figures, and one of the things you saw is because Dorothy Vaughan trained her computers, who were kind of considered the lowest on the totem pole. They had the skills by the time it came online, and no one else did, even people who had more education. Why? Because those skills weren't taught in schools and universities, because they didn't exist then. And so if you see, so what the point is, so you have a college degree, but what you know based on your college degree is not going to be what you need to know 10 years. So we've got to have a system where actually learning can lead to earning. And the tip of the spear is this group. We can go to this slide, is the stars, but this just shows the mismatch. So pre-COVID, this is on the left side is 74% of jobs created there where employers typically require a 4-year college degree. I want to be very clear. This is not to say this is where it is required to have a college degree to do this job effectively. Very much on the contrary. But the way that the signaling has worked is that the requirements for a college degree have risen dramatically, while still, it's really just about 40%, a little, around there of American adults who actually have bachelor's degrees. In fact, there's 30 million adults more that have gone to 4-year college but never completed. And so it's 60% of working adults that don't have them. So if 60% of the workforce only has access to a quarter of the new jobs, we have a situation that's unsustainable even before we started. Again, it's unsustainable in a very specific way, which is you're being screened out because of the history, right? And that you don't have, the degrees you don't have. But we needed ways to screen people in for the skills they do have or the potential they have. And that's the heart of this matter. So next slide. And so we look, and then just context for the labor market. I mean, well, for this is sort of the entire US population, give or take. And roughly speaking, about half of it, it wasn't in the labor market before, which is why a whole bunch of issues around housing affordability and healthcare and like all of these things like matter a tremendous amount in this discussion too, independent of labor markets. By the way, that 20 million slices sort of students, these are students over 18 in school. On the right half of it is people who are in the job market. So 160 million sort of active population. If you compare that to 26 million people who've filed for unemployment, you can see how large the scale is of what's happened. But we at Opportunity at Work have been focused in particular on the far right, those 3 columns, this stars. And if you go to the next slide, we're talking about, when we say stars, we're talking about people who don't have college degrees, but are skilled through alternative routes. Now, those routes could involve military service. They could absolutely community college and a whole variety of workforce training. However, the most important alternative route is work, right? But it's working typically in lower wage jobs that actually do develop a tremendous amount of skills. And I'll say about the stars, these 71 million people. This is David. We pay a lot of attention to David's work because of the particular regional distribution. But this is a group that actually has a big part of kind of every population, sort of gender, race, rural, urban, suburban. And it really is actually a unifying experience in the sense that it's not a great experience. Unifying experience is, I know what I can do, but no one will give me a chance. And we've spent a lot of time sort of with sort of stars and have a lot of work on sort of their own experience, their own pathways. And fundamentally, these are striving people who keep hitting walls and either keep trying to get over those walls or maybe get discouraged and sort of settle with them. And they are to David's point, and I think Marcella's, they are people who is the largest group among these essential workers that we've been overlooking. So next slide. What we did this work, it came out March 12th, just before our team went into fully remote work. And we did the work with Accenture, and we did it with an advisory panel, including Erica Groshin, the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Peter Blair at Harvard. It's a very great group, Michael Strain at American Enterprise Institute, and a number of others. And we really dug into using all the available public data. We wanted the baseline to be public data so it could be replicated. Sort of what were actually, if you just looked at the skills that people gained on the job, looking at like the ONET sort of survey and so forth, how does that map to sort of higher wage jobs? And there's a lot that went into it. We sort of mapped sort of a few 100,000 possible origin to destination jobs and saw which ones were real. But this slide is sort of overarching. Of these 71 million Americans, you had 5 million of them that were already in high wage jobs, that had already broken through despite all the barriers. So all these jobs that said, oh, you have to have a bachelor's degree. And I don't mean just even middle wage, but high wage jobs that they were. And by the way, a huge number of them have gotten there through some form of entrepreneurship because of the ways that the sort of more institutional system held them back. But they were software developers, they were all sorts of things. And so it was an existence proof. And then we worked actually with LinkedIn, very interestingly, to map back where did they come from. And a lot of them came from these lower wage jobs and those pathways. Marcella, as I looked at it, I think we should compare notes because I thought it was great. But then this rising stars category, 30 million of the group, 20 million of them in low wage roles, so below the median, and 10 million in middle wage roles, so less than twice the median wage. If you actually look at the skills mapping, they have skills today that are highly proximate, that absolutely bridgeable for jobs that would have transformative wage gains, that would pay 50% or more a year than their current jobs. And then there's another 36 million stars that clearly do have skills for higher paid jobs, but not with that kind of breakthrough wages. I will note that some of that has to do with the state of their skills, but some of it has to do with the structure of the labor market. A disproportionate share are women and Americans of color in the care economy. And they many of them, a very high proportion, have the skills to move up to the next tranche. It's just that next tranche doesn't pay well either. Right. And so I think there is a structural issue in part of it, and that's a different set of issues. But if we could move on to the next slide. So I don't want to go through some detail, but the sense of the work we did. So this is one of a couple 100,000, origin destination. From a kind of the job on the right pays somewhere up to twice as much as the job on the left. And what this simply says is if you look at the skills requirements, they are actually not that different. There are pieces of it that you need to upgrade, but many of the skills overlap, especially the core skills, critical thinking, negotiation, service orientation. And what we've seen is that in many cases, the higher paid job is not so much so different in skills. It's different in the contextual knowledge of how to apply those skills, and often of specific business processes and platforms. Fundamentally, you have those skills being operated in a higher productivity business system, as opposed to that the individual is so much more radically skilled. And this is particularly true in the kind of jobs that everyone trains for at work. So take Salesforce administrator, right, which is a job that there is and there will be a huge demand for. Nobody learns that at college. And so you can train people who graduated from college, or you can train people who are, frontline sales managers at a construction materials firm making half as much as a Salesforce administrator. So the point is, there's that opportunity. And the reason I wanted to start there is because it's not one of the less visible parts of what we enter this crisis with are the actual underlying skills, capabilities, talents, learning potential of these tens of millions of workers. And I think they are truly underestimated, and it's going to matter. So go forward. So here's why I think this matters for us to really understand. There's been a lot of discussion in Zoom rooms I occupy of do we focus now on just the immediate here and now, right? Do we really have time to think about like rebuilding better when so many people are suffering and all that? And I really believe that is a false choice. I believe it's a false choice. Number one, because the disruption we're seeing. So if in 4 weeks, 26 million out of the 160 million in the labor market have lost their jobs and counting, the level of disruption and the level to which certain jobs are going away for a long time, some maybe forever, and other jobs are surging. And David mentioned some of the areas that, right, like new jobs are needed. There is absolutely not going to be enough agility in our learning system, in our talent management, in our redeployment system, if we are backward looking, right, based on people's pedigree. We need to sort of like allow people to step up and show what they're capable of. And I think we should take some inspiration in what we're seeing in the essential workers that are out there, because it's not just the courage, it's also the adaptability, the resourcefulness. You're seeing tremendous things and people are noticing for the first time. And there's absolutely, we should all be part of this opportunity and not just based on backward looking. And second, the legacy institutions. I mean, we need higher education, college, all that. We need that to thrive, actually, but it's woefully insufficient, right, for the scale and the speed of what we need to do here. And then I would observe, we need a recovery model that takes human capital seriously, not just financial capital. And I want to underscore what David said when he talks about 5 points of GDP that was labor and is now capital of various sorts. That's $1 trillion a year, right? That's like over $1 trillion a year in an economy of our size that would have been going into the pockets of people caring for our elders or our children, people who are building buildings and public transportation, like getting affordable housing. I mean, there's so much work that should be done because work is solving problems. And if you look around, I'm pretty sure you'll agree, we're not running out of problems. So there's a tremendous amount of work to do. But in squeezing, right, in a system that sort of squeezes the sort of the returns in that direction, it does suppress the work we can do. And you see it in the recovery too. I mean, I spend a lot of time on labor markets and labor economics of late, but my original training is actually in capital markets, financial markets, central banking. And when I look at what the Federal Reserve is doing, the creativity and the aggressiveness and the scale and pace with which they are really supporting every tranche of sort of debt capital, right, that anyone has ever heard of, and many that barely anyone has heard of, that is orders of magnitude more investment. I mean, when I hear that we are putting so much money into supporting people, in a way that's true, but in a way that's really not true, because actually, if you the human capital stock, the sort of what people know and are able to do and learn, that's like about 4 or 5 times as valuable, give or take, as the whole invested capital of U.S. corporations. The most valuable capital in aggregate is that which no corporation can own, but only individuals can own. And we need a system that actually goes after that. So what would that mean now? As the final slide. So there's a few themes here. Number one, it is incredibly important to minimize, to the extent we can through policy urgently, the job, the income, the life disruption that people have experiencing. I think the best policy responses in the world are happening in Northern Europe. There's a version of it in Canada, in sort of, Australia, New Zealand, that is basically supporting people, directly supporting payrolls so that more people stay in work. And that doesn't mean they might not be able to do a lot of work right now, given the situation. But by the way, they could do a lot of learning. And I think as we think about the learning system, companies need to play a much bigger role in it. If that needs to be jump-started through policy, so be it. But we simply don't have the capacity in the weaker workforce system that Marcella described to do all the upskilling, all the training we need. And then which gets to the second point, which is we need reskilling investments for jobs now. So take contact tracers. At a certain point, we'll realize, because this is the way it works everywhere, if we want to get the public health dimensions of this crisis under control, we're probably going to need hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million, right? Contact tracers. And that skill set, guess what? No one has a bachelor's degree in contact tracing, right? That skill set is sort of a navigator. It's a little bit of data. It's like it's a lot of kind of counseling and human connection. A ton of people who are working in fields where they will very well have lost their jobs as counselors and so forth, could absolutely do that job. A lot of them stars, but also for 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months from now. David, you said recently that the reason you could talk about shovel ready in the Depression is because there were lots of jobs where you could show up with a shovel and start working. But there are not a lot of jobs like that. Certainly not a lot of well-paid jobs, a lot of sort of career mobile jobs. And we need people training now for the rebuild 12 months, 18 months, 24 months from now. And so I think the best we can maybe do as a country, because we're not going to be as successful as Northern Europe is at kind of keeping people in their current work, but we can, instead of having people running around, 40 million people chasing 10 million or 15 million jobs, we could have a lot of those people investing seriously with the right kind of income support and the right kind of training and context for the jobs that we're going to need on the rebuild. And then finally, there are these essential workers who will not participate in that in these next 18 months because they'll be out there doing that work. I think we have to commit as we come out of this for something akin to a jobs GI Bill for essential workers, much like when GIs came back from World War II. We didn't just send them back to the farm. We said, hey, here's an opportunity, and we funded it. I believe we have an opportunity to sort of, just as that created, in a sense, mass higher education, I think we have a chance to create a mass learning to earning system using that as the point of the spear. And anyone who is like looking with admiration and gratitude right now at essential workers, we owe them more than gratitude. We owe them a real opportunity to sort of move forward after this crisis.
Yeah, really well said, Byron. And I actually want to pick up on two of the points that you ended with as we move into the Q&A phase of this. Marcella, I'd love to get your reaction to what Byron said, particularly around the skilling piece, because you launched a report a while back around realism about reskilling. And I'm just wondering, what should we be taking into consideration as we look to training as an opportunity during this period of crisis?
A lot of what Byron said is right on, right? That skilling is absolutely necessary, because if there's a constant, it's going to be change, it's going to be technological disruption and whatnot. It's not the only problem of why workers are in this precarious situation and the low quality of work. And there's increasingly not only a matching problem, but a problem of these requirements that have little to do with skill. And we think that a bit of this transitions network, similar to the skill similarity that he looked at, can give employers a sense of, okay, if I'm looking for network administrators, hey, I can look at computer scientists, but I can also look at printer repair people, and they will do just as good a job if I just give them a shot. But part of what we wanted to say in our report, Realism, about reskilling and why we named it that, aside from saying, okay, this is hugely important, but not the silver bullet, but also show how the current reskilling system is at times reinforcing the inequities in the system, right? So what we did is looked at the user journey from the user perspective, from the worker perspective, say, what are these barriers that I face when I try to enter this reskilling system, right? And more so when you detach it from work, which is the way that most of us learn, and probably the most effective way given the changes in technology. And what we found, and particularly with low-wage workers and vulnerable workers, is that these friction points are really really inhibiting, and any programming needs to take them into account, right? Like from the entry point, we can't assume that workers have the motivation, information, and the tools to understand how to enter an ecosystem and know what should I skill for, where do I go find something that fits my needs. So you need extra work, right? The sense of self-efficacy. Many workers have had consistent negative educational experiences throughout their schooling, and that have reinforced this message that they can't learn or succeed when it comes to school. This empowerment is hard to reprogram. And most organizations actually screen for those that can complete or succeed with very little scaffolding. So it's selecting against, people who need it the most. Career navigation, sustained support, the most basic logistical barriers of childcare, long commutes. These are the people with the highest opportunity cost for their time, right? So as we think about how to structure and provide the massive reskilling that we need, I think we need to understand how our system is reinforcing the current inequities, right? Our MOOCs, which were the panacea for workers, like in a way, AI has allowed for the pedagogy that is used in MOOCs to be reinforced by the people who use them, which tend to be, 70% of those are people with bachelor degrees. So adapting our content and our offerings to these workers, I think are going to be part of what needs to change, so that this can be a moment that really makes a difference for the workers that are going to need it the most.
But can I ask a question of Byron here? So given what Marcella just said about the thoughtful approach to skilling, I'm also curious about, in the example you gave, how do you put those people back to work quickly, but also safely? Because having people go door to door and do contact analysis, it does require some level of training, and it also requires, that we have the infrastructure to protect those workers so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we're taking the most vulnerable workers and we're making them do the most dangerous work without any protection.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's part of the whole sort of system that needs to be delivered for contact tracing. And like here, I know MasterCard works globally. And I think this is a place where looking globally is incredibly useful, because there are several countries that are like well ahead of us in sort of figuring out all those protocols and the like. So I think I don't think we need to reinvent that wheel as much, but I do think that we need to think about that sort of the pathways into that. And I think it's also very important. Wages are not determined. So I say a lot, like low wage does not equal low skill. And that's absolutely right. Like the idea that it's just based on your skill, that's what determines your wage is really quite wrong. Like a social worker has very similar skills to a private client services banker, right? Like, I mean, if you think about what they do, it's very similar. And the social worker under, if anything, in a more complex system, but like one gets paid much more than the other, and it isn't the social worker, right? So there's a lot of non-market factors, and certainly non-skill factors, and then market factors, some of which David alluded to, that determine that. So I guess what I would say is what matters is systems that actually sort of integrate sort of workers on the basis of where there's a clear path. I love Marcella's example before, because what I saw in the work she was presenting was, first you have a map, right, for cities, and then you have almost a little bit like a GPS, right, for, a worker where they can start to navigate a bit. But actually what we need there is more like real-time tracking. And what's more, we need more like public transportation, not just you in your car and your own trying to find your way. Like, I mean, it's not realistic. And I think if we think about it, people who aren't stars, people who aren't in the workforce system, there's not a single person that succeeded in any of the fields that we're in without an enormous amount of mentoring, without an enormous amount of guidance, without many shots on goal. It's just who gets it and who doesn't. And like, how do we have a system that can deliver that? So on the safety part, I think safety is part of the problem to solve, and that's part of the work to do. And we need to invest in it in sort of similar ways to other parts of the system. But I do believe that we'll have many opportunities and beyond. And Marcella, all the things you're talking about, the barriers, that is exactly what we're getting at. Like, you've got to remove the arbitrary barriers, right, that allow people to show what they can do. That doesn't mean everybody's going to be able to do everything. Nobody's going to be good at everything, but everybody can be good at something. And we've got to have a system that allows them to do that. And I think in the context where there's a lot of work to do, there's a lot of new work to do, we have a fork in the road right now. We can try to apply the same old kind of like hierarchical, sort of like backward looking model to how we kind of get people into this new work. Or we can say, hey, like, like we're all sort of looking at, like, let's figure out who can do it, period, and let people show what they can do, and let many attempts go. And as you know, Parag, we are working on bringing together a marketplace that can, with providers and with talent providers and so forth, that can do this matching. And there's a lot of that activity going on right now. And I think if we bring people together, we can actually make some real progress. But in the end, you need public policy to follow it. The trick is, how do you have the sort of public investment, what clearly is to a large extent a public good in sort of developing kind of skills, but to have it work in a market responsive way that can actually match to the need as it evolves.
Well, let me go on the public policy notion here to David, because David, in your list of recommendations, there was nothing around the role of the government in employing people. And I'm curious, you know, Byron invoked the phrase shovel-ready jobs, which isn't just a Great Depression moniker. It was something we talked a lot about for those of us who were in the Obama administration right after the 2008 crash, about putting people to work, you know, doing construction related activities or whatnot. And I'm curious, do you think that there's a role for the government to play as an employer of last resort in this crisis?
I think there's a huge role for the government to play in fostering employment. I don't know that the government should be that employer directly. You know, as Byron referenced a little while ago, during the Great Depression, you know, to do construction work, you really just need to know how to operate a shovel. And now it's actually quite a skilled and credentialed activity. The Obama administration experimented with kind of, you know, weatherizing and solar installation, but it was hard to do that quickly at scale, and there were a lot of challenges that came up. However, you know, one thing the government did as part of the CARES Act, although could have done much more effectively, was subsidizing employers to keep workers on the payroll. And most other countries facing the same challenge we're facing did what we call short-time work, which is they paid employers to keep workers on even though they were working at reduced hours. And we kind of, you know, coming to a fork in the road, we took both forks. We both, on the one hand, subsidized employers to keep workers, but on the other hand, created a massively more generous UI system that actually made it a win-win for many employers to lay workers off and have them actually their wages rise. Now, arguably, why did we do that? Well, one reason is we lacked the institutional infrastructure to do otherwise. In most other, you know, Western European economies, governments regularly work with employers in these situations to subsidize employment during extreme downturns. We did not have that capacity in place. We haven't done it. And this is one of the things that actually worries me. Is, you know, as we come out of this crisis, countries that had good government capacity to respond will come out with people's faith in the government expanded. That'll happen in Denmark, that'll happen in Australia, that'll happen in New Zealand. Countries that were sort of prepared, had the expertise, had the modern information systems, had the connections between firms and businesses to kind of step in. And the US, people might come away and say, well, you know, the government, it would have been great if the government could have done this well, but in fact, it didn't have the capacity. It didn't have, you know, all its UI systems were running on COBOL. We didn't have the way for, you know, and so we could go in the other direction and saying, well, now, you know, we really see that government can't work well for us. So I'm very concerned about that. So I do think, but you coming back to your point, I absolutely think the government has an enormous role in making sure that people remain employed or return to work. And we have the fiscal mechanisms to do that. It doesn't have to be the government being the employer. It needs to be the government providing the conduits into work, and in some cases the financing to create employment in the short term until demand returns.
On the point about financing, I'm getting a lot of tweets and questions from the audience about universal basic income. And I'm just curious, David, do you expect the labor market to recover to full employment scenario? In what time frame? And is UBI a potential solution?
So I expect the labor market to recover to full employment, but it probably won't be that quick. I've not have not historically been a highly enthusiastic about UBI because in fact we had lots of work, and I would much rather pay to improve the quality of work than subsidize leisure. Not that there's anything wrong with leisure, but I don't want to. That's not where I want to put my public dollars. I would rather again use that money to rebuild employment and to improve the quality of work in terms of healthcare, paid leave, and things like that. Of course, in the short run, we're going to have a lot of hardship, and we do need to create financial supports for that, as we have done with the I don't want to call them stimulus checks, the bailout checks, and more things like that will be needed. But in the long run, I expect that we will go back towards full employment. We will still have the same demographic forces. I would like to make that work better. That's where I would like to make the public investment.
I'm cognizant of the fact that we're having this conversation about vulnerable workers without a vulnerable worker voice at the table. And so I see that our friend David Rolfe has joined the chat. And David, I'd love to invite you to hear your reactions to this conversation. For those of you who don't know, David is the founding president of SEIU in Seattle, which is one of the epicenters of this outbreak. And David, you've been thinking a lot about these questions over the years. I'm curious, as you hear us talk about the public policy solutions, the role of employers, creating new forms of opportunity, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think for the length of the now concluded economic recovery that began in 2009, there have been a number of alarm bells going off about just how unequal that recovery was. And in fact, how we have been marching away from and not toward inclusion in economic growth. I think most of us here will be familiar with the Federal Reserve's 2018 finding that 39% of Americans would have difficulty affording a one-time emergency $400 expense. Last year, Fed data also showed that over the last 30 years, the wealth of the top 1% increased by $21 trillion, while the wealth of the bottom 50% decreased by $900 billion. There was a 2019 report from the Financial Health Network estimating that only 29% of Americans are financially healthy. And a 2019 Hart Research survey showed that about 1/3 of Americans were able to pay all of their bills and save more than $100 in the most recent 30-day period. And then, of course, looking at labor share of GDP, we see that the bottom 90% of income earners have experienced a roughly 12 to 13% decline in GDP share since 1975, which is about $2.5 trillion a year in lost earning and spending power for the bottom 90%, or the difference between a prime age full-time worker making $50,000 a year and $96,000 a year. The US middle class dropped from number 1 per capita to number 27. So that if that was during a good economy with growing GDP, growing capital markets, record low unemployment, this new crisis and threat, which will not be a V-shaped short-term recession under any circumstances. We're hearing a lot of folks saying, what's it going to take to go back to normal? But I think from a perspective of not just low wage workers, but really super majorities of American workers who have not been included in economic growth for a generation, the question ought to be, can we do better than back to normal? What is the level of both government, private sector, fiscal policy, monetary policy, employment law, labor law, but what are the set of interventions that we would need to enact to actually right the ship to where hard work meant financial security for Americans, and where we had a growing, thriving, and inclusive middle class in an economy where 70% of the economy depends on consumer demand. So I think that's sort of, I guess, the framework in question I would maybe start with, and hopefully throw back. I'd love to hear what the panel has to say.
Yeah, Marcelo, let's start with you, because you described Las Vegas's situation, and I was just thinking, if you were in charge of the economy in Las Vegas, thinking about the strength that comes from strong labor agreements that protect workers, but also the very real fact that it's a city that's based on tourism and heavily dominated by the service industry. So to David's point, what would your reaction be as a policymaker?
Well, I mean, Las Vegas is showing how these kind of hard-earned, modern unions and benefits are creating a slightly more resilient workforce. it's systemic. I mean, when you think about policy, it is absolutely about strengthening worker voice, and a bunch of other incentives and roles for the shared responsibility of government and employers, right? Creating the mechanisms that, as David mentioned, exist in many European countries to be able to weather these, right? The work sharing, the portable benefits, that then become tools that can be used up or down and for different reasons because they exist, and that trust between companies and governments exists. So how can we create incentives? So as automation really increases, it gives us what it promised, which was to get the mundane and the non-human parts of work out and really elevate human qualities, right? That was supposed to bring better jobs, better quality jobs. And I think their regulation policy to create the incentives so that as companies modernize, they improve job quality need to exist. And I think this could be a moment, which is what we all hope, that if we're going to put a lot of money, we never expected $2 trillion in stimulus, that it not only deals with the short term, but we can set some of these structures of more robust safety nets, of portable benefits that deal with a very mobile workforce, and again, the incentives so that firm level behavior also changes, so that we get out of this in a more robust manner than when we started.
By the way, Marcela, we're getting a lot of requests for the skills map that you shared. How can people access that?
Sure, we can share the slides, but what we're hoping to do is put this data online and literally in the next 3-4 weeks, so that you can go in and look at every occupation and look at what is possible, as well as updated numbers of what we're seeing contracting and growing in terms of these transitions. So we hope to make something interactive available pretty soon, and I'm happy and available for specific data queries.
So as part of the follow-up to this webinar, we will share with you all the slides, and we will also notify you when that data is up and available online for folks to look at.
Rock, I think
yeah, Byron, before you jump in, I'm actually going to ask you the next question, Nick, but you can combine with what you were going to say.
I just wanted to answer David's question, though, is the only thing. Because
I want to go to David's question for you, but I also want to ask you to incorporate the conversation about gig, because some folks are saying, look, we're talking about traditional jobs and we're not incorporating gigs. So I was hoping you could do both.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I want to say that it's not a complete answer to David's question, but I think it's really important that people acknowledge, I mean, David's math is roughly right at an aggregate level. And, you know, Marcela, you're talking about $2 trillion, right, of this in this sort of stimulus bill, which, you know, there's a lot of ways the spending of it could be improved. But yeah, it seems like a lot of money. But David's point that if you take the bottom 90% of job market, that's $2.5 trillion a year, every year, right, that sort of has shifted. So it's actually not that. So that we're talking about 2 trillion as emergency response, but David's talking about 2.5 trillion that has shifted away from sort of, you know, lower wage and middle class workers in terms of their share in the growth of the economy. So I do think it's one of the hardest things to do is I don't know that I have a solution to like David's, right, that what David has put out there. But I think what we often do when we don't have a full solution, we kind of want to pretend that the underlying reality, you know what I mean? You ignore the underlying reality because you don't have a solution. But like, I think we just have to acknowledge whether you think there is a solution at that scale or not, that we do have a problem at that scale, and that the problem is exacerbated by what we're seeing right now. And so I just want to say that first. And then second, I think that in thinking about that problem, people have too much of a binary in thinking about it. Because when I say your learning should be able to lead to earning, I am certainly not saying that that's the only problem we have to solve. And when David's saying that hard work should lead to financial security, remember the hard work part. David's not just saying that, you know, everybody. So in other words, and there's just a mythology. I think frontline workers, if you look at the actual surveys, they absolutely know they need more skills. They want more skills. They want to learn all that. So there's the talent, there's the motivation for the most part. And it is not about sort of individual merit and what an individual person can, like, pick their way through the glass. I showed you the 5 million stars out of the 70 million that have gotten through that like crazy system with obstacles at every turn and like gotten there. And that's great. And we could learn from that. But a system should not require that like that level of heroism and luck in order to get there. It should be more easy. And I think that applies to sort of gig workers too. To me, I kind of see the gig work, okay, because work is solving problems and gig workers are solving problems. I think the problem is not that the work is bad. The problem is that the terms and conditions are often bad, and the instability, which is something I know, David, you focus on, but is, I think, something you didn't emphasize as much in your comments there. I think we should not underestimate the degree to which we've placed the risk of all the vicissitudes of life on individuals who have no diversification, 40% of whom have $400 in savings. And that's true in the skills arena too. Like we say, hey, you individual, you need to pick your path. And by the way, you need to take on debt to do it. And like, if you get it exactly right, maybe you'll get a good job on the other end. Let's see, right? Whereas practically everybody in that equation has more information. Brookings has more information, like employers have more information, right? Like unions actually have more information, and that in places where unions are strong, like in the skilled trades, they do actually provide a lot of that guidance. And so we cannot leave individuals on their own to do it. So the problem with the gig, I think the gig economy, if it were structured in a way where people had a sort of there's a baseline stability, then the gig economy could be great for like trying new things, demonstrating new things, learning, delivering. And why on a gig platform, your rating can help you get another gig, right? It should be integrated and should be able to help you get another job, right? If you're doing kind of gig work to a high standard, that should be part of the signal that employers can pick up on and get you if that's what you want, right? And I think we're seeing the people in the gig economy for whom it's working are mostly people who do have a stable job and are using the gig economy to supplement their income, and it's less good for people who have to depend on it entirely.
Thanks, Byron. David, Otter, your reactions to the question posed by David Rolfe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is enormous, and I agree completely with Byron that there's no single solution to this. I mean, I think that it took us a long time to get where we are, and it's going to take a long time to get back from there. We were on the 40-year trajectory of declining earnings prospects and declining economic security for people without elite levels of education, and to get back there, it's going to take an institutional and societal commitment. It has to be that we believe at a fundamental level that work should be of higher quality for many people, and that means directing our resources in that way. And it's ridiculous to say that can't be true, because there are less wealthy nations than us that do this more successfully all the time, and with a lot less social enemy in the process. So we have this fantasy that the market determines everything, and that it's just whatever it is the way it must be. We're in the best of all possible worlds because that's what the price and quantity say. But we all live in a spectrum of market economies, from the most cowboy capitalists in the United States to the cuddly capitalists in Norway. But it's all mixed economies, and our priorities set the terms of regulation, of worker voice, of acceptable and unacceptable labor standards, and of the type of distribution. Some of it is tax policy, what happens after tax, but a lot of it is pre-tax. It's the type of jobs that are sanctioned, the type of expectations that workers can have about, will I have notice if I lose my job? Do I know how many hours I'll be working next week and during what day? If I get sick or a family member gets sick, will I have leave? Will I have childcare? Will I lose my health care? Those are institutional choices. And the only way that we will change them is if we collectively, or a majority of us, feel that we must change them. And will that happen now? I hope so. I don't know. I probably did make the same prediction in 2008. And if I did make it, I was wrong, because we didn't move in that direction. We have another chance because we see how important our institutions are to our well-being. There's no private sector organization, there's no NGO, there's no corporation that could have said, oh, I know, we'll just take 10% of GDP and hand it out to citizens to deal with this problem. Only the government is large enough to solve that problem. And in some ways it's done well, in some ways it hasn't, but clearly there's no alternative to it. So this is a choice that we will have to make collectively.
Thanks, David. As we get ready to wrap up this conversation, I want to ask for some closing thoughts from our panelists, and then we'll go to our final speaker. But I want to frame it this way. During this period of social isolation, many of us locked up with our families and our loved ones. I know all three of you have children, but I also know you interact with young people, whether it's David, Otter, through your students, or Byron through the stars that you speak with. And I'm curious, the advice that you all, as experts on this future of work topic, are giving to the young people in your life of varying social economic statuses and varying skill levels. What jobs should they be thinking about? What jobs should they be preparing for? What skilling and education should they pursue? So I'm going to start with Byron, go to Marcella, and end with David Otter, and then we'll close out. Byron?
Yeah, look, I think it's extremely difficult for children. So like the stars are adults, they're in the labor market. That's a little bit of a different matter. But like for children, I think it's very hard to say like what job should you be preparing for outside of a small number. That said, I don't think it's as hard to say what qualities should you be cultivating in yourself in order to kind of be successful in adulthood, certainly in the workplace, but beyond that. And I think in terms of like hard skills, I think there's if there's a thing you're passionate about, combined with could be coding, could be statistics, could be, there's like sort of some foundational things. But what I've been actually thinking more about is qualities that of cultivating that I think we're losing to some extent, that are maybe even more important in our time. We've just talked about, honestly, this generation, the younger generation, has now seen disaster after disaster after disaster that are actually collective disasters, right? They're system disasters, but throughout their lifetime, the narrative has been about their individual merit, right, and effort and degrees and like all of those things. And I think we should be actually guiding children to care more, or to really to maintain their care, which they are born with, in cultivating friendships and empathy and listening and persuasion and loyalty and generosity and curiosity and appreciation of other people and solidarity with other people. Because I actually think what this generation is going to need to do much better than we've been doing is to find ways to engage in collective action, right? And whether that is through sort of civic associations and organizing, whether that's through labor unions, whether that's through professional associations, open source projects. We need people who have an instinct, who both kind of have an instinct to pay attention to the facts, to pay attention to others, and to both bring whatever skills they've developed to the table, but also to appreciate the experiences and those of others, to be able to work together, because so many of the problems are going to have to solve. The vast majority require working together, not working alone. So I think they should invest in that.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Byron. Marcella, what are you saying to the young people in your life?
Well, if the jobs of the future will involve building ornate virtual worlds in Minecraft, then my kids are in good shape coming out of this period. But in all seriousness, I remember asking this question of a former colleague, expert in education, and he drew a bell curve and said, well, tell me if have parents gone to college, their income, where you live, and we'll tell you the outcome, right? And this is what we're all discussing here. This is kind of the death of the American dream. That opportunity has hardened, and I think this is what we have to combat, and the strengthening the institutions that bring that opportunity. I think if I was to give advice to our kids, kind of in the Robert Putnam use of the word, I think is that in the future we know that the only constant will be change. So these skills, that we talk about, of critical thinking, of teamwork, of ability to learn, of self-efficacy, this belief that you can master new things. These should not and are not skills for the elite. You know, I have colleagues in the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings that are working on curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment that can teach this to kids in Kenya and in Finland. So there's no reason that these are not the skills that should be the expectation in every classroom in America.
Very nicely put. David, what are you telling the young people in your life?
Okay, I think I'm gonna be less inspirational and much more nuts and bolts here. So, I mean, you know, there are sort of two things I would say at different points in life. One, there's a set of foundational skills that I don't think have fundamentally changed, but are incredibly important. Skills, you know, analytic skills, communication skills, reading and writing skills, leadership skills, and, you know, and the ability to work with others, right? Many people actually have a lot of trouble just like giving a presentation or writing a coherent or, you know, a persuasive, you know, one-page memo. Those are foundational. You need those for anything you do. Then in terms of career as opposed to skills, you know, many of the great careers, you know, in going forward will be careers that combine some technical expertise with a lot of human expertise in communicating, being empathetic, and working with others. So it's not enough to just be empathetic. There's not a lot of career in just, you know, feeling sympathy for people. There's also, you know, simply just having technical skills. Many of those will, in fact, succumb to automation as well. But where those virtuously combine in healthcare, in education, in coaching, in management, in marketing, in design, there's lots and lots and lots of opportunities. So do not think you have to be, you know, a botnet herder or, you know, an AI programmer. That's just not true. Really, there's the opportunities, the intersection, where you know something technical, how to care for people, how to fix a thing, how to, you know, how to market a thing, and then you have a sense of how to interact with people who ultimately are the customers. And I think a lot of people can find work there.
You're wrong. That was inspirational. I think all three of those, teaching compassion and care, teaching people to adapt to change, and teaching people that the world is intersectional, are all exactly right. I will thank you all so much for your participation, and I would love to now turn it over to our friend Elizabeth Jacobs, a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, to close us out. Elizabeth, all yours. Elizabeth, you're on mute. You might want to unmute your line. There you go.
Thanks so much. This was a great conversation. It was such a privilege to actually be able to listen carefully for an hour and a half to some of my favorite smart people in conversation. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us online. There are many of you who've been here and stuck with us. So I know we only have a few minutes left. I'll be really brief. What I was going to do was try and summarize kind of what we know from where we started, what we came into this crisis knowing. And then summarize kind of what the crisis changes or what we think it might change, and then talk through some thoughts about what we can actually do. But given that we're almost over time, I'm just going to drill down on what I come away with thinking that we can actually do to try and use our time wisely, because I think that's actually the best thing for us all to leave thinking about. So I have kind of a long list, but I'm going to try and be crisp about it. The first thing in this very moment that I think we've learned, and we see it every day with essential workers being a very different group than I think many people think of when they think of what it really takes the economy to run. Those people who are the invisible workforce have become the visible workforce, and really going forward, making sure that we're including all workers in our protections and benefits, really thinking expansively. That's something that it seems like we can't leave behind. Second to that, I would say thinking about how to improve increased worker voice. That was a thread that ran throughout the conversation, and that seems to have played, you know, a big role in where we came in with, and that we've come out seeing the importance of that. Third, I think we've heard a lot about human capital investment, and in particular, figuring out how to boost human capital investment relative to capital investment. That kind of coming into this, we didn't necessarily have that balance right. And going forward, if we want to rebuild to something that looks very different and more inclusive than what we left behind, that's something we need to take seriously. Fourth, the matching point, really rethinking how we match workers to jobs, sort of taking human capital even as a given, thinking about how to make matching work more effectively. And finally, those big buckets, boosting government infrastructure and capacity. That one of the threads that's traveled through this conversation is the fact that we've really underinvested in what government can do, has left us really ill-prepared both to respond to crisis, but also to rebuild in a meaningful way, and that we need a government that can actually act as the intermediary that governments can do in order to build the kind of public goods and ultimately inclusive well-being that we all want to see. And then lastly, I'll leave everyone with the fact that I think we have a ton to learn about the how. Those are big buckets on like what can we do. But when we actually think about how do we do those things in a way that works for everyone, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn in terms of which institutions and which institutional partnerships are the right way to do those things. So I have some thoughts on what those might look like, but I'll encourage you all to kind of stay tuned with all of the institutions who are involved in this, including first and foremost our hosts, to learn more about what we can do, what we know, what we need to know going forward, because we have a lot of work to do, but there are a lot of really smart people who've had the time sitting in their homes right now to think hard about that. And I think we've got the potential to actually go forward and create a very different world than the one that we've left behind and that we're living in now. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you'll continue.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.